Hello and welcome back to the course. This lesson is all about complex sentences. We'll start by taking a look at the band criteria. So for a band 7, you need to write using a variety of complex structures. For a band 8, you need to write using a wide range of structures. For a band 6, you need to write using a mix of simple and complex sentence forms. And for a band 5, you are attempting complex sentences, but these tend to be less accurate. So basically, if you can't write complex sentences, you're in a band 5. You need to be using a mix of them in band 6, but to get a band 7, you need to be able to make a variety of complex sentences. And you need to be getting these correct most of the time that you're writing them. But don't worry, this is really not as hard as it sounds. It calls them complex sentences or complex structures, but that doesn't actually mean that they're complicated in any way, shape or form. In fact, some of them can be really easy to write and you're probably writing them already yourself. So don't worry, it's not as hard as it sounds. I'd also like to add that this one part of your essay can really help you transform the overall appearance and fluency of your essay. I remember one student, his name was called Dom from China, and he always wrote in quite simple sentences. The other parts of his essay were good. He had good vocabulary. It was very coherent and well structured, and he always answered the question. But he always wrote in simple sentences. But after I showed him how to do this properly, sat him down and went through what I'm going to show you now, he got it. He understood how to put these sentences and make them complex. He realized it wasn't as difficult as he thought, and immediately his grammar score went up by a whole other band and a half even. And what this made him do was it actually gave him confidence with his writing, and it made him more enthusiastic about his work. So he went away and studied even harder, and just a month later he was able to get a 7.5 overall. So from being at a 5 just a couple of months ago, these techniques that I'm about to show you really transformed his overall IELTS experience. So think about that as you're going through this. It is quite a long video, so feel free to pause and stop it whenever you need to. Right, let's get started with some complex sentences. The first complex sentence we're going to talk about is one using the subordinate clause. Have a look at this sentence, please. Globalization is changing the world. Now that is a simple sentence. It's got a subject, globalization, verb is, and object, which is the world. Now that makes perfect sense on its own, and it doesn't need anything else. So we call that an independent clause. It's one piece of information that fully makes sense on its own. This next sentence says, as it enables more trade to take place. It's got a capital letter and a full stop, but as a sentence it doesn't make sense on its own. It's not a complete thought, it doesn't work. And because of this, because it needs something else, we're going to call it a dependent clause, because it depends on something else. But what we can do is put that dependent clause after an independent clause and create a sentence like this. Globalization is changing the world as it enables more trade to take place. So here we have the independent clause, which is one simple sentence at the beginning, and then we've added a dependent clause which provides us with more information after that. And we linked it with what we call a conjunction as. So this is a complex sentence. Let's have a look at some more examples of this. The environment is being damaged because of human involvement. You can see that the environment is being damaged. That makes sense on its own. That's the independent clause. The second half of the sentence, because of human involvement, does not make sense on its own. Therefore, it's dependent on the independent clause. Another example, celebrities are rich and famous, although often lack privacy. Sportsmen are overpaid, while doctors and nurses are underpaid. Drug smugglers should be jailed, even if it is their first offence. Social media has made communication easier, although there are some downsides too. So all of those have a dependent clause and an independent clause, and they're linked together with a subordinate conjunction. Let's have a look at some of those subordinate conjunctions now. So here's a table full of subordinate conjunctions. These are some of the most common ones that you will probably want to use in your essays. I'm sure you've seen some of these before. So like I said, complex sentences aren't as difficult as they sound. You might want to jot down any of these that you haven't used before. Okay, let's move on. This is the same table, it's the same words, but you'll notice that next to some of the words there's a star. Now, this star indicates that you're going to use these in clauses of concession. So a clause of concession basically means that the second half of your sentence is going to contrast somehow with the first half. So you use words like though, even if, whereas, and even though to make a concession. And you can see that in the examples, second half takes away somehow, goes against the original idea in some way. Now, the reason I mention this is that when you use these subordinate conjunctions that are starred, that's when you need to use the comma. So if we have a quick look back at those examples, you can see we've used the comma with those subordinate conjunctions. So that's definitely worth remembering, as you obviously get marked for your punctuation as part of your grammar. Here we can see exactly what I meant. In the first sentence, the environment is being damaged because of human involvement. So the dependent clause there, because of human involvement, doesn't need the comma with it because it's not a subordinate conjunction of concession. It's just adding more explanation to it. The second sentence, celebrities are rich and famous, comma, although often lack privacy. So being rich and famous, everyone thinks is really good, but in the second dependent clause, we're saying, well, we're giving a negative aspect of being rich and famous. So that's a contrast, that's a concession. So we need the comma and although to link that together. And there are three more examples. You can read them through to yourself and you can just see that they are concessions saying something against the first independent clause. So what else can we do with the subordinate clause? Well, the Band 7 marking criteria says that we have to show good control of grammar. And one way to demonstrate that is to not always put the dependent clause after the independent clause. You can actually start with the dependent clause or the subordinate clause, and that shows that you can do both ways. So let's see an example. Celebrities are rich and famous, although they often lack privacy. That's our original sentence. We can change that to, although they often lack privacy, celebrities are rich and famous. Similarly, sportsmen are overpaid, while doctors and nurses are underpaid. While doctors and nurses are underpaid, sportsmen are overpaid. And so on. There's a further 2 examples here. You can read them through for yourself. But doing this just shows that you are capable of using the grammar in a different way. And it's quite a handy thing to do. Now, the only exception I would make is this last example. If the environment is being damaged because of human involvement, that would change to be because of human involvement. Personally, I don't like to start a sentence with because. People do it, but personally for me, certainly the way I was taught, you weren't to start sentences using because. So I would avoid doing that if I were you as well. Okay, so that's the subordinate clause, and that's one way to write complex sentences. Let's take a look at the next method. The next method is to use relative clauses. Now, these are used to give extra information about a person, place, or thing, and they are useful for reducing the overall number of words in your essay. And so this actually improves the fluency and readability of your essays. For example, the destruction of the environment is continuing at a fast pace. Most people are against this. That's 2 simple sentences. Nothing wrong with them, but it sounds nicer and it's a higher level of grammar if you write the destruction of the environment, which most people are against, is continuing at a fast pace. Now here we've simply been able to insert that extra simple sentence after we first talk about the main noun of the sentence, which is the environment. So after the first noun is, or the thing you're talking about, is the place where you add in the relative clause. And here we're talking about a thing, which is the destruction of the environment. So because this is a thing, we're going to use the word which. If we were talking about a person, it would be who or that, or a place, we could use where. So that's an example. Let's have a look at a few more. Let's have a look at a few more examples. So, celebrities who break the law receive a lot of negative publicity. A few things to notice here. Firstly, the relative clause who break the law is added after the main noun of the sentence. And also, the sentence, even without the relative clause, makes sense on its own. Celebrities receive a lot of negative publicity. That's because that it has a subject, celebrities, a verb, receive, and an object, which is the completion of the thought, negative publicity. Notice also that the subject-verb agreement works. So the subject is celebrities, and we've got the correct form of the verb, break, here. So celebrities who break. Imagine if it was a celebrity, we can't say a celebrity who break. It would have to be a celebrity who breaks the law receives a lot of negative publicity. So you just need to be careful that your subject and verb agreements match up. So do they have S's or not? Another example, technology which takes away jobs is creating poverty in some areas. Again, we've got the relative clause straight after the noun, and also without it the sentence makes sense on its own, and the verb is the correct form as well. So we've got takes. So it's not technology which take, it has to be technology which takes away jobs, is creating poverty in some areas. Okay, next one. Silicon Valley, where many technology firms operate, is located in the US. Again, after the main noun, the sentence works even without the relative clause, and the subject-verb agreement is correct as well. Convicted murderers who admit guilt should not be sentenced to death. Again, we've got the same 3 points. After the main noun, sentence makes sense without the relative clause, and it's convicted murderers who admit, not admits as the verb. Next one, countries where there is much poverty should receive financial aid. You should be getting the idea of this now. So after the main noun of the sentence, we've inserted the relative clause, and it still makes sense without the relative clause. And countries works well here with where, because that's the place. And the final example we've got is greenhouse gas emissions, which damage the ozone layer, continue to rise. So again, it's after the noun, the sentence makes sense without the relative clause, and damage is the verb which matches to the noun greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not damages, it's damage. Okay, that's a few examples. Let's have a recap on some of the main points that we hopefully learnt from that. So here are a few things to remember about relative clauses. Firstly, the clause comes after the noun. Secondly, there must still be an independent clause that works on its own, so that means it must have a subject, verb and an object. We simply insert the relative clause after the main noun. Thirdly, the verbs must agree, as in singular or plural. And you might also have noticed that there were commas. Sometimes we had commas after the main noun and sometimes we didn't. Now, the reason for this is that if the information contained in the relative clause is extra information, meaning we don't really need it to understand the overall sentence, then we use commas. If the information, on the other hand, is essential, we don't use commas. So, in the example here, celebrities who break the law receive a lot of negative publicity. There is no comma after celebrities, because it's really important that the reader knows that it's only the celebrities who break the law that get the negative publicity. It's not all celebrities that get negative publicity, just the ones that break the law. So that relative clause is essential for the reader to read. Therefore, there is no comma. However, in the next sentence, we've got Silicon Valley, where many technology firms operate, is located in the US. Here, it's not essential for the overall meaning of the sentence for the reader to read that relative clause. Silicon Valley is located in the US. Fine. We don't need to know that's where many technology firms operate. That's just extra information, that's non-essential. Therefore, we have the comma after Silicon Valley. So that's why we add or don't add the comma after the main noun of the sentence. And that concludes the little section on relative clauses, let's go on to the next type of complex sentence. So that was how you could use relative clauses. Now we're going to look at another way to make complex sentences, which is much easier, and you probably do this yourself already. In fact, I'm sure you do. So let's take a look. This is called compound sentences, and basically we need two independent clauses and we link them together with conjunctions like for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. Sometimes these are referred to as fanboys. Now let's look at an example. Globalization is increasing fast. It is bad for traditional cultures. Two perfectly good, simple sentences with correct grammar. They are not complex sentences. However, if we simply link them together, globalization is increasing fast and it is bad for traditional cultures, then we now have a compound sentence. So easy as that. And that is considered to be a complex sentence. So some people believe or think, or some students think, that it's not difficult enough to be a complex sentence, but it most definitely is, and the IELTS examiners consider it to be so as well. So it's definitely worth using these compound sentences. Let's have another look at a different example. Public transportation should be paid for by the government. It is often underfunded. Public transportation should be paid for by the government, but it is often underfunded. There we go, that's a complex sentence that would fit very nicely into an IELTS essay. So that's another way to make complex sentences. Alright, this is the exciting part where we can fit these different complex sentences together. Now, it's perfectly fine if you want to use those complex sentences exactly as I've just shown you. That's fine. However, you can attempt to combine one or two of them and make ones that are even more complex. And these are the sorts of sentences that are going to get you 8s and 9s if you can use them accurately and consistently through your essays. But the good news is they all do start simply. You just build them up. Let's see how it's done. So we've got two simple sentences here. Governments are designed to run a country. Governments receive money from taxpayers. Okay, we can make a compound sentence with those. Governments are designed to run a country and receive money from taxpayers. Right, I also want to add the fact that some governments are, or often governments are corrupt. So they are often corrupt. So governments are designed to run a country and receive money from taxpayers. However, they are often corrupt. So that's adding a subordinate clause using a subordinate conjunction, however. Now, furthermore, I want to say that most governments are elected democratically. So I can add that in as a relative clause as well. So governments, which most countries elect democratically, are designed to run a country and receive money from taxpayers. However, they are often corrupt. Now, I'm sure you can see the complexity of that sentence. That would fit really nicely into an IELTS essay, and it wasn't that difficult to do when you'd been through the steps on the earlier slides and the earlier different complexities of sentence. We could continue even further. So we could add because. However, they are often corrupt because the amount of money involved is so significant. And we could probably even add to that as well. but there comes a point where the sentences are starting to get too long and there's too many clauses to it, and that will not score you a higher band. By adding too many clauses, it becomes difficult, a bit strange to read. It's not how we naturally write. So 2 or 3 clauses is quite natural. I wouldn't go much beyond that. Okay, a few final words of advice then. So now I've shown you those different ways to make complex sentences, go and have a look at some of your past essays and see how well you're actually doing this. You might surprise yourself that you're using some quite complex sentences already. If you're not, well, have a look to see where you could have used them in your past essays, and use your past essays as practice. So take 2 simple sentences from there and see if you can make them into a compound sentence, or can you make one into a relative clause for the other, or a subordinating clause for the other. So have a look at your past essays. They're a valuable source of information to help you improve. So you definitely need to be practicing these different types of sentences, and it is particularly important that you do get these checked by a teacher or other native speaker. Could be somebody online as well, because it's difficult for a non-native speaker to know if they're correct, basically, for these. So where can you use these in your essay? Well, complex sentences basically could fit anywhere in your essay. They're particularly good for topic sentences or as supporting sentences. They provide a great opportunity for you to be able to show off your range of grammatical structures. But I will say that go with the 100% rule in the exam. And the 100% rule is that if you're not sure about it, then don't do it. So in the exam, don't suddenly start trying to write complex sentences like the very last one I showed you. You need to build up to that in your practice, and when you're 100% sure about building sentences like that, then use it in the exam. Just use the structures that you're sure of. But if you can master the relative clause and the subordinate clause, just those 2 on their own, you can probably do the compound sentences already. So that's 3 you've got. If you can master those, you'll do really well. So bear that in mind and go with the 100% rule. Okay, well done for getting through this video. It's a long one, but it's well worth going back, making notes and practicing with these slides in front of you. Okay, I look forward to seeing you in the next video.